our channel. In this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about another massive drone attack that was carried out by Russians on the territory of Ukraine between the 18th and the 19th of September of 2025. Pro-Ukrainian resources published this map, this picture this morning, where we can see that the Russians during the previous night attacked the city of Kiev, the city of Pavlograd, and the area between the cities of Kramatorsk and Pokrovsk. The Russians were attacking military positions of the armed forces of Ukraine and, of course, military facilities and different military plants. For example, a lot of updates this morning are coming from the settlement by the name of Pavlograd. The sources are saying that during the previous night, lots of explosions were recorded. Russian Iran drones hit Pavlograd, Dnipropetrovsk region. Reportedly, a chemical plant and an ammunition depot were targeted. So, the city of Pavlograd is a very important city. This is the key city in the Ukrainian logistics between the mainland and the line of combat contact. And this settlement was targeted for several times since the beginning of the special military operation. So we see that currently the situation on the ground is very difficult for Ukrainians, and they're trying to bring as many as possible weapons and arms to the line of combat contact. So this is the reason why the Russians are paying so many attention to this area, and most likely in coming days the Russians will continue bombing and attacking this territory. And this is probably one of the most important reasons why Ukrainians decided to evacuate their production. According to information we have, Ukraine is evacuating its defense industry to NATO countries. As a part of the Build for Ukraine initiative funded by Denmark to the tune of over 50 million, the Ukrainian company Firepoint plans to relocate part of its production facilities to Denmark. And we believe that if war continues for 2026 and 2027, most likely Ukraine will be forced to evacuate every single production to the territory of the European Union and NATO countries, because Russians will never allow the Ukrainians to establish full-scale production of any arms to their forces. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground. And first let's talk about the Zaporozhye direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. And during the previous 12 hours, the Russians improved their positions. First let's talk about the western Zaporozhye area. According to information we have, the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue their offensive operation in the southern part of the settlement by the name of Primorsk. As we discussed in the previous videos, the Russians are trying to get this area. This is the biggest stronghold in this region. If Russians take this territory under complete control, then Ukrainians will lose any possibilities to restore control over the territory. During the previous 2 days, huge changes were recorded. This is the situation by the end of the 17th of September, this is the situation by the end of the 18th of September, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 19th of September. The Russians continue its offensive, and according to this pace, most likely it will take up to 1 or 2 weeks to finish the battle for this part of the city of Stepnogorsk and the settlement of Primorskaya. Now let's talk about the eastern Zaporozhye direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction of the Poltavka and Uspenovka fortified areas. So now we are entering the phase of the Zaporozhye offensive operation when the major battle begins. So these two strongholds are the most important strongholds on the entire eastern Zaporozhye flank. I would like to remind you that 36 and the 26 armies of the armed forces of the Russians Federation stopped their offensive operation in the western direction, because now they're preparing themselves to meet Ukrainian reinforcement and reserves that arrived in this area several days ago. At the same time, the 5th Army continue advancing in the southern direction, and as a result of clashes during the previous 5-6 days, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. Once again, this is the situation by the end of the 11th of September, and this is approximately the moment when the Russians of the 5th Army began their offensive operation in the direction of Uspenovka-Poltavka fortified area. Every single day we were coloring this territory in Russian favor, and they were getting closer and closer. And currently the Russians are about just at 1 kilometer from the city limits of the Uspenovka fortified area. So it's nothing. There are just several strongholds between these two positions, between the territory under Russian control and the area of the village of settlement of Uspenovka. And it seems that the Russians are planning to begin a full-scale offensive in this area in coming days or maybe even hours. Or maybe the Russians have already started this offensive. First, most likely the Russians will attack the settlement of Novonikolaevka, which is located between the village of Poltavka and Uspenovka itself. This will allow the Russians to cut logistic for the armored forces of Ukraine on the Okhotniche Poltavka fortified area. But to destroy the logistic completely, of course, we understand that the Russians will try, and they need to attack also from the area of the village of Malinovka in the northern direction, with the purpose to cut this fortified area in pincers, or even to create another cauldron for the armored forces of Ukraine. And if Russians take under control this fortified area, of course, the next step would be to continue offensive operation in the direction of Uspenovka fortified area. So if we summarize everything, the Russians during the next probably months or so will try to establish complete control over this territory. If Russians are able to do this, then the Russians will be able to create a very powerful configuration with the purpose to continue offensive operation further, but this time in the direction of the settlement by the name of Gulay Polya. And Russians from this perspective will be able to attack Ukrainians basically from behind. The Russians will attack along the road Gulay Polya Uspenovka, of course, and several groups most likely will attack in the direction of the road R85 with the purpose to cut logistics completely. And of course, as with the village of Poltavka, the Russians will most likely intensify their offensive from the area of Dorozhnyanka in the northern direction towards the village of Zaliznichne. This is very important and most likely is going to be very difficult offensive operation with the purpose to cut this logistic as well. So very likely, and there are very high chances that by the end of the 2025, the armed forces of the Russian Federation will take under complete control all these territories. If it happens, this is going to be the beginning of complete collapse of Ukrainian Zaporozhye defense, because from this perspective and from this configuration, the Russians will face no problems to continue offensive operation, and this time in the northern part of the city of Orekhov. As for this offensive, most likely this is the spring military campaign of 2026, and this is the reason why the Russians are trying to secure the areas of Pokrovsk and Stepnogorsk with the purpose to attack the settlement of Orekhov also from the west, which is also this offensive also will take place probably in 2025 and 2026, at the beginning of 2026. So, of course, let's wait and see what is going to be next, but currently we need to understand that the clashes are taking place for the most important defense area, defense line, defense layer of the armored forces of Ukraine that was created probably in 2022-2021 before the beginning of the special military operation, and this is the most fortified area probably in the entire Ukraine. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Novopavlovka direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. I would like to remind you that during the previous days, after the Russians counterattacked the Ukrainian forces in the area of Andreevka, Klivtsovo and Zeleny Gai, the Russians decided not to stop their offensive, but they continue moving further in the northwestern direction. So this is exactly how the situation was developing. So this is the situation by the end of the 14th of September. This is the map by the end of the 15th of September. This is the map by the end of 16th. Now we have 18th, and this is the most important moment when the Russians began advancing in the eastern part of Ivanovka, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 19th. So we see that the Russians are trying to take the Ukrainians in pincers from the east and southeast, and now we see that the Russians began offensive from the southwest with the purpose to cross the river of Volcha as well and to cut logistic that goes in the direction of the village of Ivanovka. It seems that the Russians will try to take the settlement also in coming days. This will allow the Russians to cross the river of Volcha and from the Ivanovka foothold then to most likely attack the villages of Velika Mikhailovka from the north and to attack the settlement of Novopavlovka from the west. So always to attack from behind any Ukrainian position. Now let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk agglomeration. It seems that the Russian offensive, the Russian third attempt to assault the settlement of Pokrovsk is very successful. During the previous 48-72 hours, a lot of very important changes were recorded. So this is the situation before the Russians launched their major offensive operation on the city of Pokrovsk, the third major offensive operation. During the first day, the Russians improved their positions in the western part of the city and in the central part of the city. By the end of the 18th of September, we start receiving reports that most likely the western part of the city of Pokrovsk fell in Russia's hands. We got videos confirming that the Russians have their presence there and that Ukrainians were ambushed in this area. And by the beginning of the 19th of September, we see that the Russians, according to neutral mappers, secured almost completely the southwestern part of the city of Pokrovsk and the western part as well. So this is the biggest disaster ever for the armed forces of Ukraine, because now we understand that the Russians will continue offensive operation with the purpose to take under control this industrial zone. This is the key region of the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration. If Russians, as a result of offensive operation that is currently taking place, are able to establish complete control over this territory, we are talking about the western part, which is almost under complete Russian control, to cross the railways and to enter this industrial zone, this is going to be the end of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. From this very moment, the Ukrainians will have just one option: to run away, to escape, to quit the Pokrovsk agglomeration without any chances to save their positions, save their weapons, arms, and so on. This is going to be just the only and the best option for the Ukrainians to run, because if Russians establish control over this industrial zone from these positions, the Russians would be able to establish complete FPV drone control over the only road that Ukrainians currently use and have to support their forces on the territory of the agglomeration. Of course, everything depends not just on the situation here, everything is also depends on the situation in Rodinska. If Ukrainians can really, let's say, unblock the settlement of Rodinska and so force the Russians to fall back from this area, probably they will be able to win some time and we're gonna see no cauldron. But for example, this is the video that we got from the area of Rodinska, and as you can see, Ukrainians are trying to counterattack. They're trying to create media reports about successful counterattacks, but the only thing that we can see is significant number of vehicles and tanks that were destroyed by Russians during Ukraine attempts to counterattack this area. So Ukrainians currently suffer just huge losses, and the losses will be much bigger if they can't stabilize the situation in the western part. Furthermore, several pro-Russian resources reported this morning that the clashes has begun for the area of the railway station of the city of Pokrovsk. So we are talking about the heart of the city of Pokrovsk itself. Now the Russians are trying to take this territory also under complete control, and most likely this offensive started from the central part, from the area of this M30 road and Zakhisnikov Ukraine Street. So it seems that the Western media was correct when they were saying that the city of Pokrovsk most likely would be abandoned by the Ukrainians in coming days or maybe even hours. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next, but obviously we believe that by the end of 2025 there are very high chances that the Russians will take the city and the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration under complete control, and not just this area. There are a lot of territories that may fall in Russia's hands in coming months before the end of the 2025. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.